What up, what up? All my scientists, my artists, my philosophers, my geneticists, my roboticists, my biologists, my archaeologists, my astronomers. Let's get busy. This has been busy from the first.
To the 2, to the 1. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Busy from the Burbs, broadcasting to you from Osaka, Japan. I'm joined by my co-host today, XJ. Newly renamed, but people will still know who you are. So I don't know why we're doing that, but you told me to do it, so that's what we're doing.
Well, I'll just go by Joe. That's fine.
Or Joe. I mean, I'm going to call you XJ. Because
all right, that's fine.
I like to call you XJ. Still like to have the X in there, you know?
I used to be J, and now I'm no longer.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm
You're half the J you used to be.
Right.
Okay, so today, Psychology of Terrorism, Part 2. Picking it up where we left off. Ladies and gentlemen, the psychology of terrorism, terrorists, what makes these people who they are. The notion, the idea that this is something that is just an Islamic phenomena immediately should be dispelled. This is not a religious-specific phenomena, although I'm sure, Joe, you can make a strong case that Islam is the cult of death. However, that said, I think it's important to note that this is a human issue, regardless if you're a white, black, Anglo-Saxon, Catholic, Jewish, Orthodox, or not, Islamic, Shia, Sunni, whatever, Hindu, Buddhist, doesn't matter. You fail in the same way that any group of human beings might fail. And there's going to be psychopaths regardless of where you are.
That's true, but I feel like homegrown terrorism in the United States is just way less likely because the groups that commit terrorism in the United States generally have a core value that's tied to the well-being of the country.
What do you call the white shooters, though? All the white guys that shoot up schools and churches and stuff. That's not terrorism?
I mean, it is, but it's not ideological terrorism generally. It's, I got my feelings hurt, so I'm going to take it out on all of you. And there's like a certain element of narcissism, but there's no ideological group milling those people out, is there? They're all like the lone kind of gunman that just comes out of nowhere from their own pain and grief and inability to cope.
I mean, are they though? Like, it seems like the ideological lineage to which someone like that guy that shot up the church owes his allegiance to would be the white nationalists or the KKK movement.
Yeah, but I have a feeling that he wasn't very philosophical in that.
No, but I mean, how many really are? I don't understand, like, to which point someone needs to...
Well, I mean, like Timothy McVeigh would be the perfect example of the guy who's really deep into the ideology. And, you know, he has ties to the Christian identity movement and all that stuff that we talked about in the original podcast and group identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
How is the... I'm sorry to divert here for a second. I need to get this off my chest. How is the Westboro Baptist Church connected to the Christian identity movement, if at all?
In no way whatsoever that I'm aware of.
They are like the ultimate black sheep, like in the world of Christianity, in the world at large, aren't they?
I think that's only because of the mainstream's lack of awareness of the Christian identity movement. But let me ask you this. How many Timothy McVeighs have we seen?
Well, you have the Unabomber, Timothy McVeigh.
Right.
You have, what about, you couldn't say the Columbine shooters are.
Nah, I don't think so.
What about...
But how many
Jeffrey
Muhammad
Dahmer?
Attas are there?
Yeah, I mean, statistically, you're right. But
I think the reason for that is that see, America's identity is tied up in individual liberty and prosperity,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that that's not very conducive to going,
No, it's not.
postal or jihad or whatever. And
Right.
almost all the people who do those things are probably under the age of 21, aren't they?
Yes, very susceptible. The younger the people, that seems like the easier they are to control. And when you see the documentaries of the what are the terrorist schools called?
Oh, I can't remember now.
I forget what they're called, but they indoctrinate these kids at a very young age to not even really believe in certain inalienable laws of physics. Like if you blow
Right.
yourself up, you are going to die. Like you're not going to heaven. You're not. You're not going to the land of 72 virgins or whatever it is. You're just going to
Right.
die, and that's it. They indoctrinate them at a very early age to believe that actually it is a good thing to do this.
Right. See, my suspicion is that people like Timothy McVeigh
Yes.
share way more in common with the moderate American value than moderate Muslims do with radical jihadists. That's just my suspicion.
What I'm wondering is, what was Timothy McVeigh's motivation? From which philosophical ideology did that violence come from? And like, what was it? What was the purpose in targeting the government building?
From what I gathered, and this is based solely on Michael Moore's interview of his father in Bowling from Columbine,
Mm-hmm.
or for Columbine, it seems like the New World Order Zionist operated government, they're going to put us all in death camps.
Oh God, the Von Helton strain.
Yeah, but minus the supernatural.
Okay.
Right.
So I mean,
We
that
probably
wasn't.
shouldn't even use Von Helton as an example because nobody's going to know who we're talking about.
I don't think Timothy McVeigh really has much it's hard to equate a Timothy McVeigh like character and an Islamic jihadist, simply
Right.
because like they're, I don't know, they're two different scales of movements. Yes, they're both terrorism. Okay, that's
Right.
undeniable, but one is much more, I hate to say it, but organized than the other one. Like the Islamic jihadists, that's a machine. Like it is working,
Yeah.
it is churning out soldiers, it is training, it is carrying out operations. It's a military unto itself. However, the militia movement, the radical elements of the Tea Party movement, this is like a loose affiliations here and there. They get together and drink and then shoot guns. Like it's nowhere near the same animal.
It used to be a lot bigger than you might imagine. Around, I think it was 1993 or 4, Bill Clinton actually set up a special task force in the FBI for dealing with this people because there was over 300,000 of them.
Huh.
Which is shocking, right?
Yeah, that begins to get kind of worrisome from a federal perspective.
Right. They're like 300,000. I mean, if these people all just came down, how many people would just jump on the bandwagon?
Right. They're talking about violently overthrowing. I think there's two ways that you can affect social change violently.
Right.
One is, very quickly, very violently. The other is very non-violently, very slowly. Like those are your two options, really.
Well, I want to point out something very important,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a misconception that people have.
Okay.
And that's people's misconception of Gandhi's policy of nonviolence. Because Gandhi used violence. He did everything he could to incite British violence against his own people. He was creating violence where there wouldn't have been none by forcing people to push themselves as hard against the British as they could to make the British kill his own people and make them look bad.
Right.
That's not passive resistance, like sending people. Like if you sent 50,000 people to just like sit in the DOD or something, and you knew the U.S. government was going to slaughter them all, how is that non? You know what I mean? It's
that's an act of violence in some regard.
Yeah, I think that it is, and I think that Gandhi gets way too good of a reputation because he definitely threw his own people under the bus multiple times.
I think all of these historical characters that are beatified and people just spin these fantastical stories about their lives and how godly or how whatever noble and self-sacrificing they are. I think that's all bullshit. I think people need to pull their heads out of their fucking asses and look at these
Right.
people for what they actually were. Yes,
Right.
Gandhi. Did he promote nonviolent action? Yes, he did. Was it at the expense of his people sometimes? Yes, it was. Did he sleep with underage girls to quote unquote test his whatever that was? What was his chastity or whatever? Yes, he was. Yes, he did. Like,
Right.
these people are not good people. They're not bad people, but they're not gods. They're not saints, and they're not good. You know?
Right.
So tiring.
See, that's the thing. You and I mutually know someone who I'm not going to name on the air, but who basically puts Gandhi beyond reproach.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
I'll tell you who it is afterwards. But when I tell
You're
you,
talking
who it
about
is, you would
Kyle.
have guessed it.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. Kyle, he loves him some Gandhi.
Oh,
Some
does he?
big,
Well,
big
I wasn't
Gandhi
aware of that.
all through the night.
Just think Providence, and we'll leave it at that.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's.
But that makes sense.
I think
that
it's a
that
troll.
kinda doesn't-
People aren't going to understand. We have a friend from Rhode Island, presumably, who, or the New England area. I don't think he's in Rhode Island. But,
Yeah, he is.
who tends to, he beatifies Gandhi.
Yeah.
Someone who could do no wrong. With that said, though, it's interesting that you bring up Gandhi, right? So this is my forward thinking on radical Islam and the Islamic movement and Sharia law and so on and so forth as it pertains to Palestine, right? So you might
Right.
say, okay, why are these people doing these things? Why are people blowing each other up? I mean, why are they blowing themselves up in order to affect social change? Why don't they use language and so on and so forth in order to affect change? And one, it's because if you've ever looked at the situation in Palestine, and I know that you have your own unique take on it, so I want to hear what you're saying. Now, I'm not justifying the suicide bombing or the rocket attacks.
Right.
I think they're awful, but I mean, it's a veritable apartheid state over there.
Right.
Now, I could get some pushback for that, and I would like to hear it, but my point is this as well, that the Palestinians will never, ever, I don't care the span of time, they will never defeat Israel militarily. It will never happen.
Not with U.S. weapons in place.
Not with U.S. weapons in place, and I mean, just not. Look how disorganized they are. Like, it's just not going to happen. But yeah, not with U.S. weapons in place, definitely. But
See, I feel like the State Department made a bad argument, though, or at least a really dishonest one. They claim that the reason that we support Israel is to keep the Middle East, from uniting. But we know factually that the Sunni and Shia are never going to unite. Like the U.S., they hate each other more than they hate us.
Yeah, like, why do we have to be interjected into that? I'd like to see where the State Department said that, where they would make that claim. I don't know if they would make that.
I mean, don't you think it's implied by our foreign policy though?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, you look at AIPAC or whatever it is, the Israeli, Political Action Committee. They basically run shit in Washington D.C. insofar as the Middle East are concerned, and the Muslims are just now beginning in the last, 5 to 10 years, becoming a balancing force within Washington. But before that, if you went to the State Department's like Middle Eastern division, it was all Israeli. Like, you saw a bunch of Israeli flags. Like, the whole thing was just owned and operated pretty much by the Israelis.
Don't you think that Fox News parrots that perspective though? that we have to support Israel to keep like the Middle East.
Yes, and
And
I don't know.
and that was part of the argument for Iraq, wasn't it? That we didn't want Iran like reforming the Persian Empire. At least some pundits. See, that's the thing, is that Fox News will allow pundits to say that shit
Batshit
crazy
crazy
stuff,
shit. Yeah.
and they won't check it. They
No.
won't say no, you're wrong, and like then they have plausible deniability. They're like, well, that guy doesn't speak for the network. He's just a pundit that we had on.
Right.
But by not, they're complicit in spreading that view though by not refuting it.
Mm-hmm. What do you
It's
foresee?
like a dirty trick.
They're known for that, right? And that's why so many
Yeah.
people have grown to hate them, is because you will not get the fair and balanced view from Fox News. But relative to the rest of the media, actually, I don't know. The mainstream media has taken a turn for the worse, I think, especially in this day and age of Hillary Clinton and the reporting on her campaign. And we won't go there. I want to keep this.
Well,
this
time
back.
out. I'm so glad that you mentioned her because this is germane to the point that we're talking about. You know for a
Psychopathy.
fact that Bill Clinton will go out there and play the opposite side of her so that they can get both sides of the issue, where she can deny it if she has to. She's like, oh, well, that's my husband. He doesn't set my policy. But it's still in their heads because he's so connected to
Right.
Hillary,
Right. Oh man.
And there's a certain element of the population who thinks that Bill Clinton is going to be Dick Cheney to her George Bush.
Yeah, there are people that believe that, right? Staunch
Right.
GOPers, like multi-generational Republicans.
Well, I
What
want
do
to go
you-
into the individual psychology, though, because
Yeah.
last time we went down the political road, and I want to back up off that for a minute. I
Yes,
think we'll have
please
time
do.
for that later.
Please do.
Okay, so from what I understand, during the ages of maybe 16 to 21, the brain is creating so many new connections that there's a lot of misfires,
Mhm.
and that's why it's more than just hormones.
Mhm.
Because you'll notice that people around that age make really poor, irrational decisions, like
Right.
drinking and driving, or like that sense that they're invincible or whatever.
Right.
And I think that plays into how susceptible they are to terrorism and ideology.
Yeah.
And I think that the fact that they're mid-forming identity, and identity is the scariest part of their existence, and they're
Right.
doing everything they can to be accepted.
Mm.
Like their sense of self isn't concrete yet.
Right.
And remember, a human's brain chemistry isn't really complete until around the age of 24.
Right.
So there's a lot developmentally that's going on during that time period, which is interesting, because I wonder now if all the people who are being indoctrinated into the radical feminist social justice warrior constructs can ever escape those connections now.
Because they've just
Because-
had them hardwired into them.
Right at the ages of 18, 19, and 20.
The thing is,
Like, when
when the Manchurian candidate wakes up, he kind of recoils in horror from what he's been made to do, and sometimes can flip on his programming and become like diametrically opposed to these things ideologically overnight. Like it doesn't take much to change someone's belief, because there are examples of people who were indoctrinated heavily in a system and came out of it. They were extricated or somehow through some, I don't know, chance of fate, they ended up dislodging themselves from the corpus of the parasitical ideology, and they were able to form their own identity and, kind of rescue themselves from that.
Unfortunately, I suspect that those people are the exception.
They are. They're well in the exception. It's like 99,000 suicide bombers to one, or like a handful of people who can deprogram.
Well, it's like the anxiety that I had post 9/11 that triggered other PTSD issues that I had, especially being indoctrinated into Christian Armageddon culture.
Oh, God.
Right, so I feel like I have to give a little bit of my background here. I don't want to get too deeply into it, but I grew up in a very abusive household, and it suffered other kinds of abuses outside the house. And I was delivered from that into evangelical Christian hands, where they
wow.
basically showed me videos of the world ending and people being decapitated, crucified on telephone poles, all that,
God.
when I was like 9 years old, coming out of a battered woman's shelter.
God damn.
Right. So I
You've
feel
seen
like I'm
both
gonna
ends of it.
really get. Yeah, I've seen. I have a good perspective on this.
You were physically
Especially
abused, and then you were mentally abused.
right.
Or
Well,
you
I
were
was
physically,
physically
mentally
and
abused,
sexually
and
abused
sexually. Jesus.
before I was delivered into those hands. Right.
Oh.
So
So
yeah,
you
at the
got
age of
there.
9, I had suffered all that. Right.
Jesus. You're a fucking
So
survivor.
yeah, and I don't know. I think that I'd like to believe that the best thing about me is who I became in spite of all those things
Right,
because
exactly. So
everything
you
fucking
are the
got
exception that we were talking about then. Like, how did
right.
you arrest? Was it that maybe you had been tempered by the trauma at such an early age that the indoctrination kind of hit you as pretty weak when it
Well,
finally came, like the Christian indoctrination?
so I was about 9 years old, and I was able. I got the feeling. So I was in a radical evangelical school,
Mm-hmm.
and they would dance in the aisles, wave their hands around, shout out prophecy, scriptures, speak in tongues, and I got the
God.
impression that they were all faking it.
Okay.
Because I'm like, well, why aren't I experiencing these things? Is there something wrong with me, or are they all faking it?
Right.
And I had this layer of skepticism to me already.
Nice.
But that being said,
Do you think that it took getting abused in order to have that? Or was
I
this...
maybe here's the thing. So I was a very precocious child. My mother said that I was speaking incomplete sentences by the time I was 2.5, and I had probably about a 250 to 300 word vocabulary.
Mm.
And my mother actually said that she was sorry that she ever taught me to talk because I never shut up after that. And they bought me an encyclopedia, and like I just started reading it when I was like 6 years old.
Nice.
Oh, I don't think I ever finished it. I don't really remember too much from them, but I had this curiosity back then. And I remember being about 4 or 5 years old and having thoughts like nothing should exist. Like there's no reason there should ever be anything. How does something come from nothing?
Wow, deep
And like, I had
philosophical
these
questions.
yeah, I had these solipsistic kind of thoughts where I had a thought that maybe everybody around me was kind of
Hologram?
a program or something,
Yeah.
and they weren't real. And I had thoughts like China doesn't exist unless I'm in China, which is like kind of a solipsistic kind of a thing. I don't
Yes.
know if that came out of trauma or what, but I
Right.
know that it was there very early on. I kind of didn't really come into fruition until maybe my mid 20s even. That being said, though, in spite of all that, I was still completely susceptible to the programming because I remember when there was violence between Israel and Palestine during the Al Gore George Bush recount. Like I started having like trembling anxiety attacks. Like, oh my god, maybe I was wrong. This is it. And then 9/11 happened, and
Was that a trigger for
it's
you?
interesting. Yeah, like, well, my girlfriend of 2.5 years had dumped me, and I had just gotten kicked out of school for not going to class, and then boom, 9/11, like 4 days later.
Fuck.
Right? Kind of a perfect storm. But then, even then, the interesting thing is that unlike most people with PTSD, the news was completely reinforcing the narrative inside my head. Because
Which
like I remember when I
was?
was having my first panic attack, I had this weird thought that seems crazy now, but like this was the morning after 9/11. Like I started having a panic attack. I was like, oh my god, like Iraqis poisoned the Coca-Cola factory or something, because that was
Right.
the only thing. I hadn't eaten anything. I had been up for 36 hours just watching CNN nonstop, like everybody else, and then the fucking dam just broke.
What happened?
So I started having I was having panic attacks. It lasted 4 to 6 hours, 2 to 3 times a day for like 3 months.
Jesus Christ. So that was the trigger. Like,
Right.
everything just snapped. Now, I mean, did you at any point... What happens to a human brain, to human psychology, when it's pressured? Obviously, you were not indoctrinated. For someone that is indoctrinated, what is their response? I'm willing to bet that they don't break down and have a panic attack. I think that someone who is sensitive and maybe just might be under an inordinate amount of pressure would have a panic attack and snap, right? But the other types, the people that are indoctrinated, are just kind of like zombified. That's what I see when I think about it. That's the kind of reaction I would get from someone who is heavily indoctrinated Islamic jihadist suicide bomber. If shit like
Right.
that were to go down, it would be reinforcing all of the bullshit that he's been fed for the past, whatever, 5-6 years.
Right. You also have to remember that I didn't get this stuff dumped on me until I was about 8 years old, and I'd already suffered like 10 different kinds of abuse. So I think that it missed my core layers, but I would say still that the Bible Armageddon stuff that they put in my head still felt true at the time. But my impulse was to diffuse it as best as I could. And I kind of felt myself getting sucked back into it around 2004 when I started going down that conspiracy theory 9/11 is an inside job rabbit hole.
Okay, yeah, I went through
But
that.
I always had this feeling that those people were full of shit. This can't possibly be true. And, I spent hundreds of hours on the internet just researching, debunking stuff. I found out all kinds of interesting things that aren't on the net anymore. But I found, one interesting thing is a transcript I found of a radio interview of the guy who was the cameraman for Alex Jones when he crashed the Bohemian Grove.
Yeah.
And he said, 75 to 80%
Oh,
of the
that's
stuff
that was
Jones
Ronson.
said happened.
That was the dude that wrote the psychopath test. That was John Ronson.
Yeah, in the interview, at least the transcript I saw, it said that Alex Jones made up 75 to 80%, that they saw no male prostitution and children and stuff like that.
Right. Which was that was the running story at the time, was that there were older photographs of young black boys that were bound in secret ritual, to act like mock sacrifices, but basically it was just a giant child abuse, horror fest.
Yeah, well, why is none of that on video?
Because this was the photographs were black and white photographs from the 60s or something. Presumably that the child prostitution stuff, the child sex stuff happened earlier. And by the time Alex Jones got there, it was just kind of it no longer really happened, I don't know.
Yeah, but when you look at fraternities and the old Greek rituals and stuff like that, they pull. It's all silly. It's just pomp and circumstance, I think.
There's really no way to tell. I mean, I get what you're saying. A lot of it was fucking overblown. Like Ronson said in the interview, I think he was on the Rogan podcast. He talked about how the vast majority of it was total bullshit. Jones is he's kind of like a P.T. Barnum kind of character where there's a shred of truth there, but it's mostly just showmanship.
Well, Alex is making a lot of money that he wouldn't make.
Yeah, with his Radaway or whatever, with his InfoWarsLife.com.
Right.
Can we play that? I wonder if we can play that InfoWars Life. I think just a link to it afterwards would probably be sufficient. Yeah, we could just do that.
Because we can definitely have a third conversation on this subject.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, let's get back to the topic at hand. So you were talking about September 11th happened. You had a recurring series of panic attacks. How does that? And then we talked about how maybe a suicide bomber wouldn't just break down like that. They'd be kind of zombified and they just go through the motions. Where are we in the story now?
So, I don't know. I have a few thoughts. One is that I think we went through a cultural PTSD from 9/11 where we're just where it was a zombified reaction to where we're just going to agree to whatever the government wants. Uh-huh. I mean, how many people do you think were wishing for martial law in the days following 9/11 with the media blitz? Right. How many people do you think would have been happy to see soldiers in the streets?
A lot of people. They would have felt more secure, right? They would have asked for it.
Right. And so my argument to the conspiracy theorists is if there was a New World Order and they wanted to take down America, what better time would there have been than then? What a blown opportunity. Why allow the Iraq War to create all this, this divisiveness and allow us to become polarized against each other. You know what I
Right.
mean? And I don't think that anybody pushes. There's no more terror alerts. That stopped in like 2004 with the stupid color stuff.
Oh yeah, that was never taken seriously, and it was always like in yellow. John Ashcroft would come out, give a press conference. Department of Homeland Security itself was like just made as an excuse to try and allay people's fears, to make it look like the government was doing something to actively protect its borders, when in fact all of that can be done and should be done by FBI anyway, like, and Coast Guard in conjunction with, like, it's just another piece of bureaucracy that we don't
Right.
need. And it was great for people like John McCain, who have a vested interest in military-industrial complex and could find a way to get even more taxpayers' money into their private bank accounts by, forcing this shit on them with higher taxes and so on and so forth, because under the guise that they needed to be protected from terror from overseas.
I figured something out just now.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this guy that I talked to. He's a former police officer who was talking about like the militarization of of state troopers and local cops.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I was like, that makes sense. You want people who have experience under fire and stuff like that. But then when I think about the prevalence of PTSD and how people who come back from combat zones aren't right in the head, do we really want those people? I mean, maybe
Right.
that's why there's so many of these
Shootings?
incidents of police violence where cops are like shooting 13-year-old kids just automatically.
Yeah. It's a huge problem. It's a pretty good
Right.
working theory too,
Yeah, I mean, I think there's got to be some kind of connection. Do you really want anybody who's been in a combat zone to be this? Because
I
the
don't think I
rules of
want.
engagement in civilian society is radically different than the rules of engagement in Iraq.
Right. And you get like institutionalized in it. I remember coming out of the Marine Corps, like being in class on the GI Bill and looking around the class and just being disgusted with the quote unquote civilians, of which I was now one, but just being disgusted with like the evident lack of hygiene standards and discipline issues. And it was really, and it made me have like panic attacks. I would get like
Interesting.
I would get wound up into this this. I'm not trying to compare like my panic
Right.
attack to your panic attack, okay? I'm not equating them. I'm saying like I had my own kind of version of it, and it was like fucking really uncomfortable. Like, because I can't do anything. I can't yell at these people, right? Because we're not in the Marine Corps anymore. And I can't,
Right.
I have no semblance of authority. And I talk about this in another podcast that we do with Harrelson. I talked about it because he experienced the same thing in his class. And there's nothing you can do except sit there and kind of just, deal with it. And you want to fucking rip somebody's fucking head off, but you can't do anything. You're completely powerless.
Let me throw something wild at you that you may never have considered.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever heard of the philosophical concept of contingency?
I mean, what do you mean? Not in a philosophical context. I know what contingency means, like a plan B or something like that. But
Well, contingency in philosophy is it basically essentially means that wasn't too redundant.
mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's the idea that things could be different than they are, that things could be otherwise. So contingency means that things are malleable, changeable.
It's like an argument for free will.
I think that in these mental anxiety structures,
Mm-hmm.
in my personal experience, there's a total lack of contingency. You're not able to ask yourself, what if things are different than I think they are, if things could be different. It's more like things are this way, fret. What I feel is true. Snowball, 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 boom, panic attack.
Right. It just compounds and then explodes.
Right, because you lack the... First of all, I mean, you have to consider where your self-esteem is at when you allow external factors
Yeah, I was gonna
to
say,
get under your skin that much.
you lack personal awareness. You lack the psychological wherewithal to even
Right.
be aware of your own station, like where you are. You're like it's a
Right.
lack of awareness is what it is, and transcendental meditation and things like that might do well to kind of like serve as a bulwark against
Right.
those kinds of I don't know, psychological aberrant or aberrative emotions.
I wish I could go back in time and talk to the Ben in that moment, because the question I would ask is, why do you need other people to behave the way that you do?
Right.
And your answer would probably be, if you really thought about it and were self-honest, it would probably be somewhere in the vicinity of, well, I have a lot of my time and self invested in the structure of the way that things are. Like, I gave my life to the military for X amount of years.
Right.
And this sense of order is our worth. Our ability to follow orders is what gives us the I don't know what word I
Value.
would
It's
use,
what
but
adds
it's like the
value to-
capital to spend towards promotion, or you know what I mean? Like, obedience is the best capital for promotion in the military, isn't it? At least like on the enlisted
well, yeah,
level.
generally, I mean, yeah, in the old Corps, you used to be able to punch your superior officer in the face, and like people were like, that's what men did, and like no one got fucked for that. But
Right.
now in this day and age, you can't do that. You'd be fucking arrested. You'd be charged with assaulting an officer. You'd be in the brig. So yeah, I mean, in that sense, disobedience is not accepted. But if you are if there is, people think that the military is just top down all the way. There is a way to communicate back up the chain to kind of inform the leaders, as it were. It's just not very well developed. It does exist. It's very efficient, but it's not very well developed, and not a lot of people put a lot of stock in it.
Well, I'm gonna have to refer to film at this point.
Yeah.
Like, if you look at people who disobey insane orders, like say maybe the movie Platoon,
Right.
I think that there's probably room for that, right? Like, if your CO tells you to just walk your whole platoon to just walk into a minefield, with no apparent reason,
it's your duty to disobey that. It's called an illegal order.
Right. So that does exist, but that's interesting.
Yeah, there is a path towards that. And there's also things like request mast. For example, if you feel like your immediate chain of command is like fucking you, like let's say you got raped and you're trying to report it, but your like Gunny Duncan or whatever, who's like in charge, is there, and it was the staff sergeant that raped you. Well, Gunny Duncan is the next person in the chain of command, right? You'd think that you would be able to appeal to him. But if he's like buddies with the staff sergeant, like say like Staff Sergeant Maya or something like that, whatever his name is, it doesn't matter.
You go to the next level.
You can request mast. Actually, you can go all the way to the commanding officer, who would be the highest ranking officer in the immediate chain of command. You're allowed to request mast. It's called request mast. No one does it because in the military, it's like everyone's scared to talk to anybody that's a higher rank than them. It's weird. Like, even if you have a great idea, you won't say anything because the system is set up. It's so insular that you would never dare to think to go and talk to the commanding officer, even though there is a policy and they all say, I have an open door policy. It's like bullshit. No one is ever going to just walk in your office, sir. It's not going to happen. And you know it as well as we do. And it's an insult for you to tell me that you have an open door policy when I know for damn sure if I came to you with an actual issue, you would be like, what the fuck are you doing here? Get the fuck out of my office. And then I would get in trouble.
Civilian justice is like the opposite of that, right?
It's supposed to be, but I find it even in the civilian world, there is this weird, like, unspoken hesitation for people at a lower tier in the office to go right to the boss and, talk to him.
Right. But I'm talking about like the individual citizen victim of a crime.
Okay. All right.
So
Yeah.
I remember a name. I can't remember. Was it Lynch or something? I don't remember. There was some female Air Force officer who was raped by like 5 of her peers. And it was like stuffed by the chain of command, but then it came out in the civilian media. Now I'm thinking the Lynch girl is that girl who was rescued at Iraq who was a POW.
Yeah, Jessica Lynch was the rescue.
Right. There was some other story from around the same time period, maybe a few years later.
There was a rash of sexual assault cases that gripped the military, and all of the branches were affected, and we had to conduct all kinds of extra training. But I can't remember the specific case that you cite.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that Bill Hicks nailed it.
What did he say?
Back in the day, where he's like, he goes, where he's talking about like the Marines be like, I don't want any faggots around me while I'm killing women and children.
Yeah, right.
He's like, the moral esprit of the Corps. He's like, excuse me, aren't y'all a bunch of hired killers?
Yeah, right.
Who are you to tell me about morality? He's like, you're thugs. Why don't you get back in that foxhole until I need you to blow up brown women and children?
I do remember that bit. Oh, that's a classic Bill Hicks bit. I wish he was still alive, man. But how does this inform the psychology of the terrorist? I'd like us to recage, get ourselves back.
Right. So I think that going down the line that I did, I'm inherently skeptical. It seems anyway, from what I can remember. So I think that gave me because I recall even when I was like 12, 13, 14, it's like I wanted to believe there was a God because I was afraid of death, but I was still ultra doubtful. And as I got into college and I started taking, classes on the history of the earth and evolution and geology, because I was originally an anthropology major. I went for cultural anthropology, but I was forced to take, core anthropology courses like archaeology, primatology, and pre-human or prehistorical humans in society. And in that, I was confronted with evidence. And the interesting thing is that as far as the Christian thing goes, I tried to believe for as long as I could, but the more and more I learned, the less and less room there was for God to hide in the shadows of ambiguity and evidence.
Right.
And I eventually came to the point of where I just physically could not believe anymore, right? And I was just this hardcore I was just, at least as far as Christianity goes, I was dead sure that it was bullshit.
Did you go hardcore atheist at first? Like, was there an overreaction?
I was never a
overcompensation?
militant atheist.
Okay, so you always just kind of maintained kind of even keel in terms of your philosophical disposition insofar as God is concerned?
Yes.
That's good.
I was never angry about it. I remember feeling kind of bad for people who got sucked in by it. But no, the more that I think about it, though, in spite of all that, that was in 96, 97, 98, and then 9/11 happened. I got sucked right back into it because of those connections that were forced on me when I was 8, 9, 10 years old.
Right.
And so you think about people who are indoctrinated from birth, how easily it is for radical jihadists to go up to a teenager and be like, you know what the truth is. You're not living your life right. And they're like, yeah, I know, but I'm kind of selfish. Right. And they're like, you need to stop this selfishness and live for Allah.
Right.
And this is what Allah wants.
He's very charismatic. He has money coming from the Saudis, so he's well dressed. He has food. You have nothing. You barely have shoes on your feet, and he's offering you an education. It might be rudimentary, but it's the only education that they know in that area, and you're studying the Quran, and he's continuously reinforcing how villainous the infidels are and so on and so forth, and you're on the hook at that point. I have to wonder, who is the spirits rebellious, a la the Khalil Gibran-like character that exists in that I can't remember the name of the schools. They're like the Muja or the Mija or the
right.
I can't anyway, I have to keep hope alive that there are these skeptical minds. Even there, I think the vast majority of people, if all things being equal, these people are moderates that are then you have like the minority, which are the outspoken radicals, who then sway the moderates towards radicalizing. But as soon as the radicals go away, they're all like, thank God that guy went away. I really don't like that guy.
Right. Well, let me throw a theory at you that I have.
Mm-hmm.
So, in the beginning of The Rape of Nanking, which was written by Iris Chang,
Yeah.
she talks about U.S. warships that rolled up to the coast of feudal Japan in the late 19th century, and they thought that they were the shit. They lived in an insular society and had this macho warlord culture for hundreds of years in isolation. And then the U.S. warships just roll up and they're like, oh, fuck, we're nothing. And so then Japan launches into radical modernization and industrialization and starts these imperial wars of conquest, trying to regain their lost ego, their lost male macho identity. And they like have the Russo-Sinai wars, and they keep losing those and getting their ass kicked by Russia.
Yeah.
So they pick on the next weakest country, which is China.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe that that's what's happened to the Muslims.
That's what's happened. Yeah, exactly. We went into Iraq, we kicked ass, and they got butthurt about it. And but when I say they, I think we should be specific. It's not the Shia that is comprising these suicide bombers. I would like to know how many Shia have served as suicide bombers. I'd be willing to believe it's not that much. I think the extremist element is almost totally Sunni. So you have to wonder, okay, we went into Iraq, we kicked ass. The Saudi Sunni state and the Saudi Arabians, or radicalized Sunnis, kind of were intimidated by this, and thus further radicalized themselves in order to kind of inflate their own self-image of the Muslim man as the strong and powerful defender of Islam and all things that are holy and pure.
So I have to roll this back a long way.
Roll it.
So we have to go back to around, 750 AD in the kingdom of Charlemagne. And before the kingdom of Charlemagne even. I know I talked about this a little bit. So there was his father, Phil the Hammer, Martel, who was the father of Charlemagne, who's this giant 6'10" Viking who had a broadsword that was like almost 6 feet long. That's kind of a funny thing in of itself. But so this bears talking about, because as Sylvester Stallone said in Rambo 1, they drew first blood, Colonel, not me. For the Muslim saber rattle about the crusading infidels, but you know what? They kind of invaded Europe 400 years before that.
Right.
And they got drove out by Phil the Hammer, and then furthermore in Reconquista in Spain, which came later. And then, the Muslims came the Christians came because, well, it's a long story, and the Comitatus, I'll save that for another time because it's kind of interesting. But basically the Crusades happened because you have to buy off your loyalty from your warlords in Germanic Viking nomadic sort of culture. I know I'm lumping a lot of stuff together there that doesn't really belong for the purposes of this conversation, whatever.
We'll parse it later. That's fine. Go ahead.
Right. So they had to have new land to give away. And Phil the Hammer stole a whole bunch of land from the church in exchange for saving the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay.
And so he just took all this papal land and gave it to his warlords, but there was none of that left 100 years later by the time Charlemagne was around, and and Charlemagne gave some of it back to the church, etc., etc., etc. Anyway, they needed to buy off this stuff, and they had no land, so they created these Crusader kingdoms in the Holy Land and gave that as the spoils for loyalty. And that's why the Crusades happened. Plus, it was we need to rescue the Holy Land from the Palestinians, etc., etc. But the Muslims drew first blood.
That's what you're saying. You're saying that the Crusades were a response to then Muslim aggression.
Right, against Jews in the Holy Land, and and plus their invasion of Europe.
So
they almost conquered Spain, man. Like the
I mean, they
Muslims
did.
almost conquered Spain at like 760 or 770 AD.
They had a lot of Spain already conquered,
Right.
didn't they? I mean, they had
Yeah, yeah. I
territory
mean, but
up.
here's the interesting thing is that they did that because they were number two. The Asians were running the world at that point.
Was that
Like after
Genghis?
the fall of Rome, like China was like the kings of the world for a long time.
Really?
And
What year was that? And who was the Chinese emperor at the time?
I don't recall names. But you have to remember that Islam was number two and Europe was number three as the backwater.
Mm-hmm.
But Genghis Khan kind of changed all that, didn't he?
Right.
He crushed the Asians and he absolutely annihilated the Muslims. The Muslims were like one of the pinnacles. Baghdad was one of the peak places in the world. I don't know if you ever remember Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves with Kevin Costner
Yes.
and Morgan Freeman.
Yeah.
But like he's
Azim.
looking through the telescope and Robin Hood like looks to it and he's like shocked. He's like,
Yeah.
"What? What is this voodoo?" And
draws
he's like,
his sword,
"How did
yeah.
your uneducated kind never take Jerusalem?"
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's a classic.
But they
scene.
got crushed by the Mongol hordes. They got emasculated. They got turned back out of Europe. Then they got crushed in the Crusades, and they got crushed by the Mongolians even harder.
Mm-hmm.
And then the United States comes in and starts interfering and telling them this is a place that's been, and we have to go even further back than that. So how many times was Iraq conquered by invading hordes going back to Sumeria, Babylon?
I don't know how many.
Dozens.
Dozens.
So these are people that have been getting conquered since the beginning of civilization, maybe as far back as 10,000 BC,
Right.
before a written record.
So this is
Because the
like
Fertile Crescent was
informing.
very strategically important to civilization.
Here's a question that I have. Where are the majority of suicide bombers coming from?
Probably Saudi Arabia.
Right, Saudi Arabia. Why is it that in Saudi Arabia, a country that is probably one of, if not the most oil-rich countries in the world, why is it that they are able? Why are they using religion still in this way? Why haven't people woken up? What purpose does it serve to have people who are mentally unstable and pledge no allegiance to themselves or their families other than to Islam?
I think I could answer this question for you. I think you have to look at the U.S. relationship between the common man in America and corporations.
Okay. What
And
corporations?
you have to consider the
Which
fact
corporations?
that these Saudi oil princes
Uh-huh.
don't share the money with the common man.
So this is what it is, right? It's a distribution of wealth. Call in Bernie Sanders.
Well, let me flesh this out a little bit before you comment.
Okay.
So you have to consider that, right? And you have to consider, all right, what are the odds that some poor person is going to be able to assassinate Obama?
Very low. Very low.
What are the odds? What are the odds that a Saudi oil prince could get assassinated by Al Qaeda?
Higher than a poor person assassinating
it's got
Obama.
to be almost infinitely higher, right?
Yeah.
And
Why
so
isn't it
you have
done?
to
That's the
realize that these people are making money off the West, which is viewed as a betrayal of not just Arab, even like Bedouin values that go back, to time immemorial.
Pre-Saudi, yeah.
They're fucking over and selling out their own people to Western values. So basically, what happens, I think anyway, is that the imams and the ayatollahs have to really push down hard on the populace, like in Iran, like banning Western music and clothing, etc.
Yeah.
In order to give to the illusion of the terrorists that they're not too complicit in dealing with the West, but they still have to make their money to keep their power.
This is the devil's advocacy that I hear coming from the camp that's attempting to like defend Saudi Arabia. They're saying, "Oh no, they're just exorbitantly wealthy people that are caught in between Iraq and a hard place. Literally caught between Iraq and a hard place. Like there's no excuse."
True,
I don't believe that. I think that
ask Saddam Hussein.
Saddam Hussein is not applicable here because Saddam Hussein was a secular leader who didn't espouse radical Islamic beliefs, whereas the Saudis are endorsing these. It's a contradiction in terms.
Out.
What?
I have to call a timeout here.
Go.
Saddam had like a half dozen to a dozen bodyguards. Do you really think that was to deter the West or fucking people like Al Qaeda?
It was definitely for Al Qaeda. Why is he
Right.
intimidating the West with bodyguards?
Right. So here's
We'll
the
fucking
thing,
drop
right?
a
I
bomb
think
on
that
him. Call it a
insofar as
day.
you look at that, Saddam Hussein had a way more control over the military probably than the Saudis do
Uh-huh.
of theirs, and Iraq's military is way more prolific than the Saudi military.
Hmm.
But that being said, I mean, you might as well have Sharia law when you're under a brutal dictator, right? It's just his rule. It's just one guy's
Yeah.
totalitarianism over another's. So I think that it doesn't matter that it's a religious force, but it was still a force that kept the religious people under control, because he would he would kill the Kurds, the fucking Al Qaeda, whoever got in his way,
Right.
with the sociopathic sons. And
Yeah, I guess
chemical
that
Ali.
doesn't make him much of a better person. I think the only thing that I can look to is the fact that he was secular, and that
Right.
I see secularism. I put that on a higher tier of I don't know, of
You would if
acceptability
you
than
weren't
I
me.
was it. What?
Because I view nationalism as the same exact thing as religion. I think the nationalism is a religion. And military, and totalitarian worship of, in the Spartan sense of military might, is just the same as religion. I think they just have different names for the same thing.
I mean, it does have all the same hallmarks as a religion,
Right.
national identity,
Right.
espousing
Right.
this core founding fathers and core religious documents instanced in the
Right.
Constitution or the Bill of Rights and so on and so forth. But I think
what's interesting though. Like,
I think.
let me-
Wait a
let me
minute. Can
finish
I
out
just
real
make
quick.
this point real quick? I think that
Yeah, sure.
that equating nationalism to religion is akin to equating science to religion. I think that like science itself, like what we see in a structure like the U.S. government, is the modern form of what we see in like a Saudi Arabia with a totalitarian dictatorship that's headed by a monarchy and so on and so forth. Like these are not equatable.
Well, let me ask you a question.
What?
Are the founding fathers deified?
Absolutely, they are.
And has there been an election that didn't involve a Bush or a Clinton in the last, I don't know, 25 years?
No, yeah, you're right there. So, I mean,
Just
that's the thing. Like, we tend to want to point fingers, but maybe we should be looking at ourselves. Like, he who lives in a glass house should not cast stones, and so on and so forth.
well, let me ask you this.
We're getting to
quick.
the end. This will be the last question, and then
All right.
we'll wrap it up.
If the Republican leadership had any foresight or understanding at all, why would we have protected Saudi Arabia against Iraq during the Gulf War in '91?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, right?
If we let Saddam go in there and take out and kill all the radicals and the royal family and stuff like that, then like that would have done our job for us. Just like we should have let Iran and Iraq like kill each other, like in the same way we should have let Stalin and Hitler kill each other off and not interfered.
History,
How many times is this gonna bite us in the ass, man?
It seems like history is a testament to the failure of U.S. foreign policy, and that the only reason we get by is because we have great people in this country who are smart as fuck and who choose to live here as opposed to someplace else. That's the only reason why. I mean, Silicon Valley could have existed anywhere in the world, but it exists in the United States. And we're getting by on the strength of the ingenuity of our people, and not through what it should be, the strength and the foresight and the effectiveness of our institutional systems, our government, and so on.
Yeah, closing thought. If America really owned up to its moral imperative, we wouldn't have pussied out to the policy of containment time and time again, which has objectively failed.
Right.
Look at North Korea. Look at Iran.
Yeah.
Look at Iraq.
Yeah.
And it's just clearly failed in every instance.
I'm wondering.
Yeah, I
Go
mean,
ahead.
the only time, I'm sorry, Cuba, I guess it succeeded. But what threat did Cuba ever really pose, except for being a highway for someone else?
Yeah, right. I mean, it was more ideology there than it was actual functional strategic. I mean, besides the Russian missile crisis, right?
Right.
The Cuban missile crisis. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the discussion. I want to ask you a question in closing. Can we put this to bed? Is this
No, we just opened up so many cans of worms that
okay?
it may take us 10 more podcasts to sort
So
this all out.
there's going to be a psychology of the terrorist part 3 then.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, there you heard it here first, folks, and we will follow this trail down the rabbit hole and see how far the rabbit hole goes. Thanks very much for listening again. If you enjoyed, were educated, or entertained by the podcast, click the PayPal link and donate. We are run 100% off your donations. We'll be setting up Bitcoin as well soon, so you'll be able to donate via that way as well. Thanks very much to my co-host Xainish, and thanks
Oh,
to
wow.
thanks to you, the listener, and thanks a lot to Kyle, who still has not updated the website, which is cool. I guess you can just disappear for a month and not tell anyone. That's fine. Do whatever you want. Anyway, just joking. Thanks very much again, Xainish,
Yep.
and we'll check you all on the next one. World peace.